Hello, welcome back to our channel, fans. All content I create is purely speculative and based on personal opinions. Hayley sensed the moment Bill began drifting away from her not through any particular sentence or a single unmistakable look, but through a heavy silence that started to seep into the spaces between moments that should have felt peaceful. He still treated her with polite gentleness, still carried himself with the dutiful attentiveness of a devoted husband. Yet somewhere in his gaze, Hayley could see a distance quietly widening. Their conversations no longer sparked with excitement. They simply moved along like obligations being checked off. When he touched her hand, the old feeling of safety had turned into a hesitation she couldn't quite name. Hayley once believed her marriage was as solid as the fortified walls around Fairmont Crest, but now she could feel each brick loosening and falling away in secret. The fear of losing Bill opened a dark place inside her, one she had always sworn she would never step into. She began to think about keeping him not only with sincere affection, but with psychological maneuvers, with the deliberate choice to turn herself into a fragile woman in desperate need of protection. The idea of an attack, at first, was nothing more than a warped flash of lightning in the middle of a sleepless night. Hayley lay staring at the ceiling, listening to her heart beat out of rhythm, and pictured Bill panicking as he rushed to her side, ready to trade anything just to keep her safe. That fantasy brought her a sick, warming comfort, as if he would only remember how much she mattered when he almost lost her. She tried to shake it off, telling herself she wasn't the kind of person who would use fear and injury to bind someone to her. But day by day, the possibility of Bill leaving became sharper, the way he ended calls more quickly, the nights he came home later with work as an excuse. The distant look when he stared somewhere for too long without noticing she was watching. What began as a shameful thought slowly transformed into a script she arranged in secret inside her mind, then refined, polished, and justified until it looked less like a scheme and more like an accident no one could trace. Randy entered that plan in a role that disgusted him as much as it trapped him. He wasn't a stranger. He understood Hayley, and he understood the long-standing insecurity she carried after living in the shadow of other women, of past ghosts, of the gnawing fear that she was only a temporary choice in Bill's life. When Hayley finally voiced her desire to become the victim of a staged attack, Randy reacted with outrage first, then with the exhaustion of someone who knew refusal would never be enough. In her eyes he saw the frantic, fever-bright light of someone who had stepped too close to the edge to turn back. He calculated the risks, imagined the police response, the hotel cameras, Bill's questions, and he still knew a plan like this could never be clean. Yet his caution couldn't overpower his fear of being pushed out of Hayley's life. He had stood on her side too many times to suddenly become the one drawing moral boundaries. So instead of pulling her back, he started looking for ways to make the wrong choice less catastrophic, lying to himself that he could control the danger if he was the one holding the script. Lynette arrived like a convenient detail in a high-risk game. She owed Randy a favor and was facing legal trouble she needed to smooth over, so taking a wad of cash to play the attacker wasn't difficult to sell. At first, Lynette treated it as nothing more than a performance in exchange that benefited everyone. She got money, Hayley got a heartbreaking story. And it all ended once the bruises faded and the case was quietly filed away. But Lynette wasn't the kind of person who knew how to stop at the right moment. The instant she saw the engagement ring flashing on Hayley's finger, she realized this wasn't just an act. It was a doorway into larger opportunities. That ring wasn't merely jewelry. It was a symbol of wealth, the stamp of a marriage with power behind it, proof that Bill had far more to lose than the small fee Lynette had been offered. If a woman like Hayley was desperate enough to stage an attack just to keep her husband, then the man behind her had influence and value far beyond the original arrangement. The moment Lynette decided to keep the ring, the plan already cracked began slipping out of Hayley's hands and into another set of colder, more calculating ones. The night the attack happened felt like a nightmare in which Hayley was both the writer and the real victim. As she walked down the dark street outside the hotel, knowing Lynette was waiting in the shadows, her knees still trembled. She had agreed to let Lynette hit her, had nodded along to the idea that pain and bruises were the price of credibility. But the moment the fist actually landed, everything escaped the boundaries of imagination. Pain split across her cheek like a blade. The metallic taste of blood flooded her mouth. Her body slammed against the cold ground, and suddenly none of it felt like acting anymore. Fear, once only a prop in her mind, became violently real, and Hayley panicked with the raw certainty that she was being destroyed inside a game she had created with her own hands. She screamed not because she remembered the instruction to make noise, but because survival instinct convinced her she was being erased. Dazed and shaking, she could no longer tell where the performance ended and where her body began to truly break. After that, everything moved too fast. Bill appeared with a face drained of color, the world shrinking into the sight of him lifting her up, calling for an ambulance, racing beside her toward the hospital. Hayley trembled and at the same time sank into a twisted sense of victory because he was finally afraid, finally holding her as if her existence was the only thing that mattered. Yet shame slipped in quietly, too. She knew she had pushed it too far, that the wounds on her body were no longer simply the result of a plan, but evidence she might not even have the courage to own if the truth surfaced. When she had to recount what happened to doctors, to police, to Bill, she realized her memory was warped by panic. She couldn't remember how far she had run, how many times she had screamed, what the attacker had said, whether a bag had been grabbed, or whether it was only punches before the figure disappeared. Each time she was questioned again, her story shifted unconsciously, adding a dark jacket here, erasing an alley detail there. At first those changes were merely the aftershock of trauma, but gradually they became a sign that invited suspicion. Bill was the kind of man who had weathered enough storms to understand that truth is often consistent in a cruel way. People who are truly attacked tend to cling to certain fragments: a smell, a sound, a single sharp image, a specific scrape. With Hayley, those fragments slipped away like sand between fingers. He tried to deny his doubts, telling himself the bruise on her cheek, the split lip, the broken breath were proof enough. Still, the hardness in him refused to fully sleep. And when Lynette suddenly appeared not only as a woman seeking Bill's legal help, but also as the helpful stranger who brought Hayley to the hospital, something inside his mind shifted. Lynette demanded to keep the ring as a vague guarantee, as payment, as leverage she could use later. The greed in her eyes made Bill's spine go cold. He had no clear evidence yet, but the instincts of someone familiar with scams and manipulation told him he was standing inside a story that didn't fit. Randy, meanwhile, confronted a private kind of hell. He went to the hotel on Hayley's urgent call, slipping in through a service entrance like a true accomplice. When he saw the aftermath, an incident that looked almost too carefully arranged, he understood Lynette had ignored the limits he tried to set. Her choice to keep the ring wasn't only greed, it was a declaration of control. What was meant to be a staged attack, already dangerous, had turned into both an ethical weight and a legal trap that could tighten around everyone involved. Randy called it a $10 million mistake, but behind that number was fear of losing his freedom, his reputation, even the small piece of life he still believed belonged to him. He left the hotel burning with rage, angry at Hayley for her reckless selfishness, and angrier still at himself for never learning how to say no at the moment it mattered. Lynette, on the other hand, watched the chaos with the eyes of someone who believed opportunity was blooming. She wasn't so broke she was desperate for money, but she was starving for power, for the sensation of stepping into the world of people like Bill, Hayley, Randy. The kind of people who could make decisions that changed other lives. Keeping the ring was her way of announcing she wasn't merely hired help, she owned a share of this secret. When she began making demands, she didn't speak like someone wounded, but with the calm certainty of someone who understood her position. She wanted more than a small payout. She wanted Bill to use his influence to soften the charges hanging over her head, wanted a new home, a new life underwritten by someone else's collapsing marriage. Little by little, Hayley realized she was no longer controlling the script. She had become the lead character in a blackmail drama Lynette was directing. When Bill accidentally caught Hayley and Lynette together at the exact moment Lynette was half threatening, half negotiating, the vague doubt in him became a storm. He didn't need to hear every word. He only had to see Hayley's clumsy panic, Lynette's sharp, predatory eyes, and the ring that should have been on his wife's hand now sitting in a place it didn't belong. In that instant of betrayal, what hurt him most wasn't even the possibility that the attack had been staged, but the feeling of being turned into a pawn. He had put his trust and his life into protecting Hayley, and now he had to face the possibility that her fear of losing him had made her destroy the very man he had tried to be. Yet instead of exploding, Bill stepped back and let his fury cool into the cold determination he needed to find the truth. Details that once seemed meaningless began to settle into place. He remembered Johnny briefly mentioning that she had seen a familiar silhouette near a dark alley by the hotel, too hurried and frightened to be recognized. He remembered Chelsea hesitating as she admitted Hayley's description of the attacker's escape route didn't match the direction the hotel's cameras caught a female figure leaving the scene. He remembered Jacob quietly placing a copy of the security report on his desk with a neutral remark that there were gaps in the footage, as if someone had deliberately avoided being captured. Those fragments once dismissed because Bill wanted to believe his wife now assembled into a painful image. Hayley found herself cornered in ways she never anticipated. She had believed she could control the exaggeration, use panic as smoke to hide contradictions, but the longer it went on, the more she couldn't tell what she truly felt and what she was manufacturing. Fear of Lynette exposing her, fear of Randy abandoning her, fear of Bill seeing the deception, everything fused into crushing pressure that pushed her into even worse decisions. She tried to adjust her statements, tried to convince herself that if she just made it through this phase, if Bill softened, everything would eventually settle. But each new lie carved a deeper groove of guilt into her mind, turning her into someone she barely recognized. Randy stood on the thin line between loyalty and survival. He understood that if the truth came out, he would not simply be an assistant to wrongdoing, but an accomplice. He wondered whether he should confess everything to Bill, sacrifice Hayley's image to save himself. Every time he saw her in the hospital shaking, desperate, still trying to perform the perfect victim, he felt torn between old compassion and a newer, uglier anger. And he knew Lynette would not stay quiet if she felt her demands weren't met. She had tasted power. She had grown comfortable holding a secret like a blade against other people's throats. Silence now meant handing his future to the bottomless greed of a woman with nothing left to lose. Lynette, meanwhile, began pushing things further than even she had planned. The thrill of making Bill listen, of forcing him to negotiate, gave her a dark pleasure. But the higher she climbed, the more she forgot she was standing on the edge, too. Each new demand tightened the noose around everyone involved, including herself. She started believing she was smarter than all of them, that as long as she held the ring and the truth about that night, she could steer the entire story. That confidence made her careless, letting slip small cracks, a sentence that revealed a detail only someone present from the start could know. A moment where she used the exact expression Hayley had described the attacker having, a sudden appearance somewhere a stranger had no reason to be. Those errors landed in the eyes of people already suspicious, turning Lynette from a troublesome side figure into the center of an oncoming storm. When Bill finally sat alone in his office, staring at the security files, the transcript copies, the photograph of the ring in the report, and Jacob's scattered notes, he knew it was time to make a decision he couldn't undo. He could keep pretending everything was coincidence, that his wife was a pure victim, that Lynette was merely an opportunist who wandered into the aftermath. Or he could accept the truth that the woman he had vowed to protect had dragged him into a badly staged plot, willing to use bruises and terror and blood to force him not to leave. Either choice hurt. One demanded blindness, the other meant shattering the home he had built with careful hands. His anger wasn't only aimed at Hayley, Lynette, or Randy, but also at himself for not seeing sooner, for letting pity dull his instincts. And in the hospital room, Hayley sat alone, gripping the blanket until her knuckles turned white, feeling the cold space widening between her and Bill. She understood the cracks were now visible, that her shifting details had created a maze she couldn't even navigate anymore. She knew Lynette was slipping out of control and Randy was standing at the threshold of betrayal not because he wanted to hurt her, but because he was trying to save himself. Everyone in this story had been pushed to a wall by private fear, private ambition, wounded pride, and layered mistakes. What began as a fabricated attack meant to hold on to love had become a shattered mirror reflecting each person's true face, exposing shadows no one could hide forever. And somewhere behind the discreet, manicured walls of Fairmont Crest, the truth was beginning to speak, waiting for the moment it would erupt. When no lie would be strong enough to save them from the schemes they had created with their own hands.